Hello, and welcome to another edition of Not Your Granny's Opera Podcast. This is episode 4, and today I'm excited because I have a really interesting shout out, which was an epiphany for me. And then for Kaline's Corner, we're going to talk about marriage. And later in the podcast, I have an interview with one of my really good friends, Rachelle Moss, who's a contralto, which is a really rare voice type. It's a low female voice type. And she lives out in Seattle, and she's hoping to do some stuff in Germany here pretty quick. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Let's get to the shout out for the week. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was sitting watching TV with my girlfriend, and there's a few things that we like to watch together. She really loves watching judge shows, which I wasn't necessarily against when we started dating, but I got into them, like Judge Judy and the People's Court and all that stuff. And then we also would watch really terrible reality TV shows. Like, I'm a huge fan of The Real Housewives of Potomac, which is really just a side thing to this whole idea of writing a Real Housewives version of La Belle Hélène. That's just an added bonus because I was already writing it, and then I get all this inspiration and stuff, so it worked out really well. And then the other one that we like to watch are these terrible shows like Maury Povich. Okay, so 2 or 3 weeks ago, we're sitting there, we're watching Judge Judy, and my girlfriend's like, we should go to Maury. Because the thing was is that Judge Judy, even though she's originally from the East Coast, they tape out in LA, so we were trying to do that. But obviously we don't live in LA, we live north of New York City. So she's like, yeah, Maury tapes in Connecticut. It's like a little over an hour away. We should just go to it. So we got tickets, and we went, and it happened to be the very first taping for their new season. And it was pretty epic. I mean, it was everything you could possibly imagine. We had cheaters, we had paternity tests, and we had dramatic transformations. It was amazing. Okay, so, and for the first half of the taping, because we actually got selected to be in more than just the original amount of tapings, we were one of the few who got to do the next round of tapings too. The very front row, we were on the very front row for this first half of it. So I was like, I could have literally went out and touched Maury. And of course he's like a television icon, or at least a really well-known television celebrity, because he's been doing this for so many years. I mean, we were there for the beginning of the 21st season of the show, so it's been around a while. Okay, so what does that have anything to do with opera and inspiration and all that stuff? Well, I go to this thing, right? And for a while, and I just, started thinking about what would it be like if we had a talk show opera. Now, for those of you who don't already know, there is a show called Jerry Springer the Opera, which is actually a musical theater piece. But they call it an opera because in its form, like recit, aria, ensemble, all that stuff, it's more operatic in its form than like straight dialogue for a really long time that's interrupted by a musical number. But the singing itself is on the musical theater side. It's not operatic at all, unless you get real opera singers to do it, which I haven't at least seen a production. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I haven't seen it. Also, if you really want to see something crazy, watch that show. An entire production is on YouTube. It's great. It's so funny, but it's a little over the top and maybe inappropriate for especially younger viewers, so that's just your fair warning. So anyway, I ruminate on this idea, and I've also been talking with Sammy and just thinking about, we love the Magic Flute music. The story is kind of not one that we really want to tell, or, there's a whole fact that in the beginning of the show, there's a dragon that Tamino comes out and kills, and, well, we don't really have a dragon that we can take to every performance. So what were we going to do about this? So I was like, oh, well, I could somehow maneuver that into a talk show thing. So that was the first idea. And then later that night, actually, the thing is that my girlfriend, she was doing a training for her job in Kentucky. She got back super early in the morning. She wasn't supposed to get back that late, but plane issues. And so she got hardly any sleep before we had to go to Maury. So when we got back, she took a nap. Okay, and I did some music stuff, and then Dr. Phil was on, and I was like, well, this will be interesting. And so he was dealing with an issue that one of my family members, he was talking to a couple about their kid, which this kid has some issues that's very similar to somebody in my family. And so I thought, well, this would be informative to watch. And then I started thinking, well, what if instead of like a crazy show like Jerry Springer or Maury, what if it was more of like a Dr. Phil situation? Like, could you imagine if, like, for example, in Elixir of Love, right? Nemorino can't get a girl. He loves Adina. He gets an elixir. Long story short, they fall in love. End of opera, right? Well, what if that elixir doesn't stop and he starts drinking all kinds of different things? Because the elixir really is just brandy, if I remember correctly. It's just alcohol. It's a regular everyday alcohol. I think it's brandy. So maybe he goes off the deep end. So then you would have like Dr. Phil talking to Adina and Nemorino, and he'd be like, "Now, Nemorino, I see here that you have issues with your drinking, and you can see how it's affecting Adina and your relationships at work. And we are here today to give you an intervention." So, it's like, oh, well, that would be funny. It could be kind of like an operetta potentially, so you do have some dialogue, and then you do, you pick, maybe stuff from Elixir or some other thing. Or you could even do it with Mozart Arrested. So it would be like, "Now, Nemorino, I see you have a problem with your drinking, and I think you can also see that it's affecting Adina and everyone around you. I think you need an intervention, and that's why we're here. I hope I can help you, even though I have this really thick accent and you probably can't understand me." I don't know. Just ridiculous, right? So, long story short, the shout out goes to Maury initially, a little bit Dr. Phil, I suppose, because these things are the things that inspire me. I don't want to have opera be stale. I want it to be relatable. I want it to be also just something that people could never see it actually being, but that they actually like. Now, let's move on to Coline's Corner. Today we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, marriage. If you had to take a guess right now, how many times do you think the woman who's been married the most has been? Married the most in the entire world, or like the world record. How many times she's been married? Would you say 5? Funny, you're still wrong. It's not high enough. Yes, Linda Wolf in Indiana has been, how many times is this? This is confusing. She first got married at 16. She's an older lady, of course. And is now a grandmother with 23 ex-husbands, which sets the world record for the most married woman. All right, well, hopefully the 23rd time's a charm. Now, for the dudes, I don't know if this person is related, but his name is Glenn Wolf. So we have 2 Wolves. So, if you start dating someone named Wolf and it gets a little bit serious, you might want to Wikipedia their name at least, just to make, do your research. Make sure that they don't have a track record, or they're predisposed to get divorced, through their genes or whatever. I don't even know if that's a thing. It's probably not a thing. But it's not helpful if you have someone in your family who's just like, yeah, just divorce them. It's fine. You'll find someone else. I did 22 other times. All right, Glenn Wolf. He was a Baptist minister. Okay. And he holds the record for, and he went way past Our Lady. He's dead. He died 20 years ago, actually. But his record is 29. Oh! You know, this is where doing research ahead of time is helpful. Actually, Glenn and Linda, they were married. Like, he was her last husband. The more you know. Wait, hold on. Yes. See, I mean, I could do research ahead of time. I just think it's more fun for you to watch me screw up and laugh at my idiocracy from time to time. Okay, so this is from Wikipedia. It says his shortest marriage lasted 19 days and the longest lasted 11 years. His final marriage was to Linda Wolf, who we previously mentioned, who holds the record for the most married women of 23 times. The marriage was a publicity stunt, and a week after the wedding, she went back to her hometown in Indiana, but kept her married name. Let's go to celebrities. We all have our celebrity marriages that do and don't work out. So we're going to talk about length of marriage, because I think it's almost shocking at how quick some of these were. So we have Kim Kardashian and Chris Humphries. Of course, he's an NBA player. I can't remember if he's still in the NBA or not. But that was only 72 days. So, hey, that's 10 weeks and 2 days. Man, these people. Oh, no, Mario Lopez. Everyone's darling hunk, AC Slater from Saved by the Bell. He was married to his girlfriend, who was known as the Doritos hottie, Ali Landry. It was only 18 days. 18, man. That is quick. Shortest celebrity one according to this list, at least. So, sometimes marrying your childhood sweetheart or friend works out. You know, they grew up with you. They know you really well. I actually, oddly enough, when I was in high school and stuff, I had these group of friends that I had grown up with, but we all played sports together growing up, and most of us we were on the tennis team. Yeah, all of us were on the tennis team. Yeah. I don't know if that says anything about me. We also did track together too. But all of them except for me married someone from our high school, and all of them are still married. None of them got divorced. So sometimes it works out. However, Britney Spears, she got the knot tied with her childhood friend, Jason Alexander. No relationship, I'm assuming, to the actual Seinfeld star. I'm not even going to look that up. I don't care that much. But back in 2004, it was, get this, 55 hours. Not even 3 full days. Like, how bad was that? Okay, I got to read this. Okay, so 2004, the pop star tied the knot with her childhood friend Alexander. Well, Jason Alexander, after partying in Vegas. Are we sure we're not talking about partying? I mean, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, like marriages. Fake marriages, short-term marriages, elopements. Despite the fact that the marriage immediately made headlines all over the world, it lasted a mere 55 hours before it was promptly annulled. Alright, so there's some information about marriage. Now, how does this relate to opera, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Opera, of course, is not immune to marriage. There's lots of scenes in opera that take place at wedding parties and all that. Of course, let's go over some of the more famous ones. Probably the most famous of all of them, of course, is The Marriage of Figaro. I mean, it's all baked into the title. One of my favorite shows. It's just full of hijinks and comedy and trying to give the middle finger to the bourgeoisie, but ultimately to catch a cheater. The music is just some of the most famous operatic music. I mean, the overture itself, I'm sure even if you don't listen to opera, you've probably heard it at some point on a commercial or in a movie or something like that. All right, another one is Lohengrin. Now, Lohengrin, of course, is a Wagner opera, and this is where the infamous wedding march actually comes from. If you want some context for your wedding that's coming up, when you hear the ba 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 da ba 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 ba, yeah, and also that was obviously very good singing. How I'm not famous yet? I don't know. Like, that was stupendous. Like, I feel for me, it was like some of my best. We can't talk about disaster marriages and things that go wrong post marriage than Madame Butterfly. Of course, in Butterfly, Cho-Cho-san, or Butterfly, um, she gets all wrapped up in the joy of her wedding day. Pinkerton signs the contract, but then he leaves. And the next time she sees him, because it had been a really long time, and he comes back with a different woman named Kate Pinkerton. You see how they both have the last name, so he clearly got married in the United States instead of keeping that marriage from Japan. So that did not end well, and she eventually kills herself. So, it's always happy when people come back with different women in opera than what we expect. So, all right. Well, that ends Kaline's Corner and the shout out for the week. So stay tuned for the interview. Today I have a very special guest and a dear friend with me. This is Rachelle Moss. She's a contralto, which she will go into what that is. And I'm excited to talk to her about the modernization of operas. And she's done a few shows with me, and just to get her take on what it's like doing those and also being a singer right here and now. So why don't you give the people a little bit of an introduction of yourself.
All right, here we go. I am Contralto Rachelle Moss, and I went to the University of North Texas, and I was a young artist at Sarasota most recently. And upcoming, I am covering Principessa and doing one of the smaller roles in Sor Angelica with St. Petersburg Opera.
All right. Now, you mentioned that you're a contralto, which is a really, really rare voice type, which it's much like a Wagnerian voice type, where it's almost a different path for singers than other traditional, coloraturas or lyrics or whatever. What are some of the challenges that you face in the beginning of your career? Because most of the people who really get going that are contraltos are a little bit or much older than you. So how do you deal with all that, and what are some of the issues?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest issues that we have, and I think this is particular to the United States. I think that in Europe, they have a stronger history of opera itself and of voice training for opera, so they have a better understanding of voice types than we currently do in the U.S. So one of the biggest problems that I face is just assumptions or misconceptions about the voice type itself. Earlier in my career, during my education, people would tell me, don't call yourself a contralto, you'll never get work. Because what do people think about contraltos, first off? That we don't have high notes.
Mm-hmm.
Which is false. If you look at the repertoire itself, most contralto roles have to sing above the staffs. They have to sing A flats and sometimes even B flats or Bs. So this concept that we don't have high notes is one of the biggest problems. And the second being that we are a type of mezzo-soprano.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this, I think, is the U.S. wanting to just combine and I mean companies in the U.S., wanting to combine women's voice types into two groups, sopranos and mezzos. That just makes it easy for them and cast within those two types. And what ends up happening is you get people who are great artists and qualified in every other way, but they get put into a contralto role and you can't hear them because guess what? Their voice doesn't cut in that particular tessitura. So I think that's the biggest issues. And there's a plethora of research and pedagogical information about voice types that I think if more people in our industry read about, it doesn't take that much time. If they inform themselves about it, they would make better decisions.
I mean, we do have Wikipedia after all. It's like the bastion of all knowledge. So
right. When most composers are writing something, they aren't always just writing for a voice type. A lot of times they're writing for a particular artist. And that artist may not have what we consider to be the archetype of their voice type.
True.
A great example of that I like to point out to people is Leonora in La Favorita. That particular singer that it was written for had an extraordinarily good lower extension, which is why that role sits a little bit roller with these leaps up to high notes, but it's better for a lower voiced mezzo than a higher voiced mezzo.
We have quite a long history together, but we're just going to specifically talk about the last two Opera Muse shows, which you did with me. Of course, you were our very first gender bender role, which was the commendatora in Don Giovanni. She was the dean of students instead of, one of the really big important people in the town. And then, of course, every mezzo or contralto, potentially every mezzo or contralto's favorite role, or a favorite, is Carmen. Right. So what was it like working with I call it a living libretto, because not only is it new, you're actually working with the person who wrote it, and so therefore we can make changes as we work through it and stuff. And how did the modernization make it more of an engaging experience for the audience?
So let's first talk about the living libretto. I think it was very refreshing to work with an English translation that I didn't find poetic necessarily, right? That wasn't your goal to make it. It didn't always have to rhyme. You didn't feel confined to those things, and that made it really refreshing, because a lot of times those poetic translations aren't. They can be nonsensical, right?
Totally.
They don't always make sense. So that was really refreshing, and it gave this realness to the character as if it were in the original language, which I think is what's most important when you're translating things. And how that impacts, audiences. Then they're not trying to make sense of the translation in itself. They can just pay attention to the story, which is what's most important when you're performing an opera or producing an opera. Is you want to tell the story so that people can, get all the points of the story clearly, but also, what's the end object of art is to make people come away with a different perspective on something, right? And I think specifically with what you've done with Opera Muse, shortening it to just around an hour, really plays to the lack of attention span of a modern audience. It's hard for modern audiences, us being included, as we go see things, sometimes to not be distracted by our daily lives when we go to a show that is longer than an hour. We're like, oh God, okay, how much longer do I have? You'll catch yourself checking your phone in the middle of a show. Like, you paid to come to this. Don't you want to be here?
Yeah, exactly. If you're not, recording the thing, as some people do.
And I think that helps reduce some of the intimidation of going to an opera, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have a certain amount of time that you've dedicated to it, and people find listening to things in other languages in um, not the same time period that they're used to. I mean, I'm a fan of period pieces, so that never bothered me, but that's me, and another person may have a different opinion.
Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah,
might be.
yeah. I think that one of my main goals, obviously, with this modernization is making it accessible. But so many people feel that it's just a lot of effort to go to an opera, not
Yeah,
just, I'm saying, even if it's free, if it's a full length opera, it's really intimidating because, like, man, I gotta sit there, I gotta be quiet. As you know, in like some of my recitals, I've been heckled, which, I don't think we've had hecklers yet in our shows. Who
I've
knows?
seen
Maybe there's a libretto
that
waiting. Wait, say that again?
I may have been the heckler.
Well, yeah, you were one of the hecklers I've had. It's fun. I mean,
Yeah,
that's how opera used to be, people talking
exactly.
throughout. Like, if for those people who don't know, in a lot of the original operas, and even in Mozart, which is a couple hundred years from when opera started, they repeat things a lot. And for a modern audience, you're like, why are we repeating this? I mean, is the composer just making it easier so they don't have to write more words? Why are they repeating it? Kind of the same thing, it's the same music. Is it for emphasis? It's like, no, because people were talking and like socializing and doing all these things. They repeat it so that, if it's repeated 3 times, hopefully you'll get it one time all the way through, even if it's kind of broken up, right?
Yeah,
So,
going to the opera was incredibly social,
yeah.
and it wasn't just for rich people. I think a lot of people have this misconception as well because, you know, yes, there were rich people there, and that was a large part of the audience. But there were also, as with any art form, there were cheap seats.
Mm,
That were standing room only, perhaps, but there were cheap seats. And
yeah.
I think that I think that we'll talk. We'll talk about that later.
Oh, okay.
One thing that I didn't mention earlier about modernization was specifically with the living libretto, how well you kept the intentions of the original story.
Mm,
And whether you did it on purpose or it just kind of was happenstance, it was kind of wonderful. Like when I read through the Carmen score, I said, man, he just kind of nailed Carmen's character, even though it's set in a completely different time period and different circumstance. Right? She wasn't a gypsy in the updated version. She was a stripper. She was still ostracized by society and still looked down upon for what she did,
mm,
and how that affected her character. And it still worked.
yeah.
That's why I thought that was fantastic.
Oh, that's always the intent. Like, I know that a lot of traditionalists, which I'm always like, there's the door, honey, this isn't for you. But traditionalists often will, put their nose up at me or whatever, like, wait, you're you're defiling our original opera or whatever. I'm like, no, I'm still keeping the essence of what these people are all about. Because if you don't do that, then basically you're just ripping the music and putting a whole new story on it. Um,
Right.
Even with the upcoming show with La Belle Hélène, which for those of you who haven't watched the previous videos, that's basically the story of Helen and Paris and their elopement during Greek mythology. And we're putting a Real Housewives flair to it. There's a lot of different and moving pieces there. And so if I went completely one way, like if I went all out Real Housewives, it wouldn't be La Belle Hélène. It wouldn't be true to Offenbach. If I went mostly Offenbach, but kind of Real Housewives, that. It's really not quite as far as it could go. So you have to keep the essence of these characters, and I think it's really, really important to figure out what those characters, what their thing is before you even start writing. Now, some of these things I discover as I go through it, but I try to get a basic gist of who this person is and how is that going to be different than how I want to portray them right now. Because I mean, Carmen, yes, she was a stripper, and very much in terms of the essence of what she is in the original show. But then you have Escamillo in our version, who also was a stripper, who plays a bullfighter, but he's the worst stripper ever. I mean, you could argue that maybe Escamillo isn't what he is because, you know, in the real version, he's an actual bullfighter. He's actually seen some things go down and seen his friends get killed or dismembered or whatever. But
he still has this,
bravado, yeah.
Bravado to him, yeah, which is what's really important about his character is that he's just like, I'm super manly and I ooze confidence no matter what, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's really important to me to keep the essence of the show because otherwise it's really not the show. It's just stealing music, which technically I guess you could do because it's public domain, but that's not how I want to live my life. So, moving on, what are some of the big issues in your mind facing the opera industry, and how can we be more inclusive for our audiences, regardless of whether or not we do the modernization in the way that I do it?
Right. I think one of the biggest problems I see across companies is this focus on spectacles or gimmicks.
Okay.
You'll see, and this has to do with how they're doing, how they're, you know, how do I say this in an eloquent way? They want to bring audiences in, so they'll come up with something for, you know, particular show. Maybe it's they bring in a big name designer, whether that's a costumes designer or, you know, the person who designs the sets and things. Or they'll have a really big dance company do something. I don't know. It'll be just like one thing that they'll really focus on with shows. And I don't want to pinpoint any particular company. Or maybe it's a set piece that's really expensive and moves in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they'll pick these things and they'll try and make that the focus of the show when the focus of the show is the story.
Yeah, exactly.
I think they lose, you know, the whole reason why they're putting on an opera, you know, and I think it has a lot to do with the influence of popular culture and what they see that is successful in that world, and they're trying to bring a piece of that into the opera house to try and get butts in the seats. And I think that, you know, I do consider myself a bit of a traditionalist. I do like traditional productions. But there is a place for modernizing opera or, you know, doing these more intimate settings. You know, something that we both know about because we're in the, you know, you were in the Seattle area. When Seattle started doing their little, you know, chamber operas, they're well received and people really like to go into those operas in more intimate settings. And I think that's something that a lot more companies should be doing. You know, and it can be as a way to try and get people who are intimidated by these large productions and in the theater to come to.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, that I know companies have done this in the past where they will have at least some of their show nights be in English.
Mm-hmm.
Done with the second cast, so that, you know,
yeah,
the first cast isn't having to go back and forth between the language on the same show, because that can be
really tough.
But, you know, there's a long history of operas being performed in whatever the vernacular language is. I mean, when opera came to the United States, almost everything was done in English.
Mm-hmm.
That was what was done during that time period. If you went to La Scala in the 1840s to see Carmen, which I guess you couldn't see Carmen because it wasn't good. Anyways, it would be in Italian.
Yeah.
To Germany, it would be in German. I think that we're sometimes too obsessed with doing things the way that they've always been done or in the language. I mean, I do believe in, elevating yourself and educating yourself and pushing yourself beyond your own limits, but you have to start somewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I've always said that, these fancy productions, a gimmick is a really great word for it, because the analogy that I like to use is, it's just like you took your beat up Volkswagen Beetle from 1970 and put a brand new paint job on it and took out all the dents and then said it's a brand new car.
Yeah.
No, it's still a hot mess under the hood. There's still hundreds of thousands of miles on there,
Yes.
but it just looks pretty. So, and again, it's all about the connection with the music and stuff like that. And so I feel like the chamber idea is a way that bigger opera companies can definitely utilize, because a lot of these shows can be scaled down. I mean, it's honestly just cheaper. I mean, if you want to look at it from a pure fiscal way, it's just cheaper to do chamber opera, and then build your audience that way. Then when you have more money, you can do these big fancy things. But it should never, the spectacle should never be more important than the singing.
Right, and I've been in some productions, where the spectacle was the costumes, and that's great. But if you don't have good singers, like, what's the point of the good costumes? Or,
Yeah.
If you don't have, it all has to come together. That's what opera's about. It's about the music. It's about the story, and it's about, there is an element of theater, right? Of the set itself and of the costumes. You have to have all three of those things to put on opera in its fullest form.
Yeah. Totally.
A kind of personal thing for me with opera is male dominance, right?
Mm-hmm.
At every single level of what we do in opera, it's male dominated. At the level of executives, it's what, 80 to 85% males running companies.
Mm-hmm.
Female conductors are there? Very few. How many female stage directors are there? More than there used to be, but
still very few.
And even when you look at the way operas are written, there are always more male parts.
Mm-hmm.
So, for the most part, I think that definitely, if I were a modern composer, I would be writing things with, either more female parts or more equal part division.
Yeah, totally. Which, as you know, is one of my goals with the writing the shows that I do with gender bending stuff, because it's not solely about giving women more opportunities. It's a completely different take on a character when, especially traditionally, the bad guy is the baritone. Well, what if we had a mezzo do it?
Right.
Like, it puts a completely new spin on it. In the production of Elixir that I'm writing right now, the Dulcamata is a woman. She's going to be this bartender who also has this side business of giving out the miracle elixir to everybody. And, with most things that we learn growing up in our society, that usually would not be the person you would expect to play that role. And I think it's just fun. I mean, I'm sure that sopranos get sick and tired of playing the ingenue.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to not be an old lady for once.
Yeah. Hey, maybe you should be Scarpia. You could probably do it at pitch, too. But, it's really fun when companies can think a little bit outside the box. You know, Seattle Opera, as I already gave them a shout out in a different podcast. But for those of you who aren't familiar with this other production that they did this summer, they did with O&E, so Orpheus and an Euridice. And they did it with an all-female cast, all-female production team. There was a few, just because it's SATB chorus, there were some men in it, but all of the principal characters were women, and it changes the relationships that are in that love story. They also modernized it and put it in a hospital. And so it's just a really cool and honestly easy thing that companies can do. You know, I think a lot of times with expensive productions and stuff, that's actually the harder route. You know, finding a smaller, unless you have an actual opera house that is dedicated to what you do. You know, if you're one of those, like a lot of the companies that are regional companies, they may or may not have a set opera house. You know, why not, instead of going to the really fancy theater, maybe go to a theater that's a little bit smaller, has less overhead, and you can still do all the things, or most of the things, that you normally would do anyway. So this is more getting outside of the modernization of the industry itself. What do you think are some of the most important skills for an artist to have, especially, you know, if you're early on, or maybe like the next stage in the career, which is where you're at right now?
Right. So I think number one is communication/language.
Mm-hmm.
Our whole job is communicating. We're communicating a story on stage, and the better fluency you have with each language you have to sing in, the more effective you will be at communicating your story. But that also goes with when you're working with people from other countries. Being able to communicate at least a little bit and understand their language can make your job way easier.
Mm-hmm.
Networking is second. I think we're not taught in school how important networking is. I would say that over 50% of the jobs I got in the last 2 years were through networking. They weren't from auditions.
Mm-hmm.
So be nice to your colleagues.
Yeah.
Don't forget.
Yep.
I've got two more: discipline. You won't always have a voice teacher or a coach to tell you what you should be doing. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to have the discipline to figure out, okay, this is a role that I know I'll be doing sometime in the future. Sit down and learn it. I set a goal. I try and learn 3 new roles a year, whether I'm performing them or not.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that same discipline goes to, you know, making sure you practice and taking the time to do your research, and, you know, making yourself read the story and recite the text, you know, go through your music in a very slow and analytical way, because, you know, it's real easy to just jump in and say, okay, I'm going to sing through this.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really give yourself that discipline of going through each thing with minute detail, you're going to be a better artist for doing so.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I think that in learning the roles that people learn and becoming a better musician, which of course everyone's different, they all have different processes and all that. I find that it's the process that makes the biggest difference. Because, just like you said, I'm just going to sing through this like 2 or 3 times. I'll probably have it memorized. It'll be fine. Okay, maybe you do have it memorized for that moment. But then, you know, you're doing the first run in the rehearsal space, or in the space you're actually doing it, and you have a mind blank and you can't recover.
Yeah.
That's why, you know, having a process that is over and over and over and over again, even prior to the first rehearsal, then, you know, as both of us have experienced, because we've talked about it, there's many times when either we forget things or we don't know what's going to come out of our mouth next.
Yep.
Which sometimes that works out fine, And sometimes it doesn't. And some people, especially if it's in a language that they have some facility in or it's their native language, you can make things up on the fly because you have to, because it doesn't really work. But yeah, I think a lot of artists, they have to figure out what their process is and what helps them to really solidify all of that. And I agree too with the networking. I mean, not only does networking help me, but I think honestly, because of writing all these shows, it's networking that I'm able to even do them because I have friends, right?
Yeah.
That are gracious enough to try new things and to definitely work well under their pay grade, not because I want to pay them less, but at this stage in the game, there's only so much I can do about that. Maybe I'll get one of my shows at the Met, and then I'll invite all the original cast if they're still singing, and then I'll be like, "See, I got you your Met debut if you haven't already been here yet." So, so who knows?
Yeah, you don't know where somebody's going to end up. I mean, you could work with somebody, and maybe it wasn't their best day or their best project that they've ever done, but be careful of how you treat them because they could end up somewhere down the line and you just have no idea.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
I kind of touched on this. Analytical skills is really important. You have to analyze your character. You have to analyze the music. You have to analyze the original story. I mean, there's so much research involved in what we do. Analyzing the language. There's another one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's underplayed when we teach new artists how to do their job.
Mm-hmm.
So many people want to focus on beautiful singing and all that, but I'm sorry, you could sing the most beautiful habanera, but if you don't know anything about the story and what the character's actually doing, it could be the most ineffective habanera ever.
Oh wait, so you mean like Celine Dion's? Sorry, I had to.
Oh gosh, I feel like now you have to link that.
Yeah, you know what? I will do that.
Because it's a very nice. It sounds good, and she does cool things, but obviously she doesn't really understand what she's singing about.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I try really hard to not bash other singers, but that's just a funny one. Like even people who, like, if you watch here's what I'll do. I'll link that one, and then also a few singers that actually do it. Like that's one of their signature roles, and then people can decide for themselves which they like better. Which, as a tangent, a lot of opera singers have problems with like Celine Dion doing that, or Pavarotti having Sheryl Crow do La Chirarem with him, which already is kind of weird for me because he's a tenor, not a baritone. I mean, I think they do it up a full step or something like that, but still. But the thing is that if that's how some people, that's their first interaction with opera, that's at least a start. That's better than nothing. But
well, we've talked about this too, like with the modernization. So you can have a piece that goes unperformed because nobody wants to do it for a variety of reasons, or you can have it modernized and it gets done.
Yep, totally. I mean, that's one of the big things, especially this coming season with Opera Muse. We're planning on doing that combination of Les Amants and the Coffee Cantata, which the Coffee Cantata, it's not that it's not done, but it's not a Bach normal cantata.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, if you're a Bach person, you've probably performed it or you at least know of it. But the everyday person, when you ask them if they know any Bach, that's definitely not coming up. And then Les Amants, Rameau is a famous composer, but this is definitely not one of his more known pieces, but it's got such great music, and we're going to interweave the two, because by themselves they're about as long as our normal shows are, but storyline-wise it doesn't make sense to do one and then the other. I don't want to have two one-acts. I want to put them all together and make an interesting story. We'll see how it goes. But hey, it's all about the effects of coffee and how crazy that is on teenagers. So it's something to look forward to, I think. All right, so last question. I always ask this to all of the artists, some variation of it. And that is, what are some of your favorite moments on stage so far? And any embarrassing or funny stories that you would like to share?
Okay, so favorite moments on stage. Getting to perform Mrs. Lovett in its entirety was pretty amazing. But my favorite moment of it is, of course, Little Priest.
Oh, yeah.
That duet is
So
just
good.
so much fun. And you know, when you get close to another castmate, you kind of like create your own little inside jokes when you're on stage.
Hmm.
You know, to keep things fresh and alive as you're doing things over and over again. This wasn't actually on an opera stage, but when I performed Omneris' Judgment Scene for an outreach for Seattle Opera, that was a highlight. Getting to sing, you know, one of my favorite roles that I hope to get to do in its entirety one day, and getting to do Carmen, which I have you to thank for that.
Yeah, and it was awesome. It was so fun, just like hearing, you know, because the recording that I was listening to as I was prepping it was Gheorghiu, which of course she's a soprano, not exactly the color. I mean, technically, yes, I suppose a soprano can do that whole role at a house. Maybe it depends on the size of the house, but it's not the color.
There are alterations that you can do. There are, you know.
Oh yeah, true.
There's higher parts that you can take instead, and they're noted in the original score. I have a critical edition in there. So.
Yeah, but I just think a role like that, it's so much better when it's a more deep's not even the right word. More colorful and warm voice, because she's supposed to be seductive, and I'm not saying that sopranos can't be seductive, but the way that it's written, it just makes way more sense for a lower voice to do it. So it was a lot of fun, especially putting that show together, because I think that everyone was stretched to something that they may or may not have necessarily done before, or at least if they're somewhat familiar with that role, they obviously didn't expect that. You know, I don't think Andrew, who is our Jose, thought that he would be popping pills all night to deal with his PTSD. You know, I definitely know Julian has not used the Toreador aria to be a terrible stripper. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was an incredibly fun production.
Yeah, ton of fun. I think for me, you know, my favorite moment on stage, I guess I usually just ask, but then don't give mine. Let me put it this way, one of my favorite moments on stage is partially because of a moment prior. So, for those of you who don't already know, which you should know by now, both Rachel and I, well, Rachel does work for Seattle Opera. I used to work at Seattle Opera. And one of my favorite moments was when we did the Contralto, which was a couple summers ago. And it was a crazy show. So much fun. Probably the most fun I've ever had as a chorister. Hands down. Because of the various roles I got to be a medieval knight that was a mix of medieval knight with a Kiss cover band. I got to be a nun. And then in the beginning scene, which is where this moment comes from, it was just me and one of the other guys in the chorus. We were both lovers, and we just got to run around and prance and do fun stuff. But in Ori's very first aria, he comes down from the ceiling, literally, and I'm watching him, and then eventually it gets towards the end, and he's got all these high C's and stuff, and the person singing it was Lawrence Brownlee. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Lawrence Brownlee, he's arguably one of the best American tenors. He happens to be African American. And I first saw him, I had heard of him prior to seeing him for the first time, but I was in France doing a summer program, and they had the Bastille Day concert every year. Happened to be there in July, and he was a last-minute fill-in for Juan Diego Flores. So we show up like 5 hours before this thing so we could get a decent seat. And all of a sudden, I hear "A Mes Amis," and I'm like, "Oh right, who's it gonna be?" And we had been told it was gonna be Diego Flores. And then I'm like, "Wait, that's not Diego Flores." And I look over on the big screen, and it's Larry Brownlee. And I was like, "Yes." So, you know, I got to hear him sing two of my favorite arias in that concert, and then to be there, and with the staging, he's doing all these high C's. I'm literally at his feet. It was just one of my favorite moments because these people in the audience, they're getting a great show. But I have literally the best show because I'm right there. It's just so
I remember
incredible.
when we were doing Dutchman and when Greer was singing.
Oh, yeah, that too.
We were doing a production of Madame Butterfly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the famous humming chorus at the end. Well, this production I was in, we had a pitch pipe backstage, and I was in charge of it.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, pitch pipes can be finicky, and I was trying to blow through it, and nothing was coming out. And I was getting a little anxious. I was like, okay, I really need to give people their pitch.
Yeah.
So I gave it a little bit more oomph, and it honked. And everybody is trying not to giggle backstage. And, you know, I don't know if anybody can hear it out front. And the conductor just, you know, the backstage assistant conductor just looks at me with this glare like I did it on purpose. And I'm like, I'm trying to hum here.
Yeah. Oh, I have to tell this story only because you brought up a pitch pipe. So I was a TA, of course, in my master's. And I was the assistant conductor of the top choir. And the first year, I swear my only job was moving pianos. And then I moved up from there to being the pitch pipe person. Okay. And then the next semester I actually conducted. But so we're doing this huge donor event, right? Because we're the top choir. And what we traditionally did is we had like 2 or 3 songs that we're working on for the concert. And then we had these canned set Idaho songs, you know, including the alma mater and all these other things. So it gets to that point where we're doing this one particular song, and there's a little talking intro, and then the conductor points at me to give the pitch. Well, I gave a pitch. You see where this is going.
Yeah.
But it was nowhere, it wasn't like it was a step low or like a step and a half. It was literally a 4th low. Now this piece, it's not a hard piece, but like it already sits at like the bottom of the bass range for most of our basses. Thankfully, we had a legit true bass. So like instead of hitting Fs, he's hitting like Cs on the bottom. And everyone was just like, we didn't know what was going on. So our conductor, he's just like, do it again. Because it like started off like in C. It's supposed to be an F. And like halfway through, it was like D-ish. And so he just figured if we repeat it 2, maybe 3 times, it'll eventually get to F. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah, and so, shocker, I didn't get to be the pitch pipe person anymore after that. Darn it. But, yeah. Well, it was great to interview you and to talk to you and, of course, see you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about Rachelle and what she's up to, I will link not only her Patreon, because she has one of those too, but also her Facebook page for her singing and also her website. So you can support her if you so feel inclined. And you can also just check out to see what's new and going on with her. So thanks again for coming, and I'll see you all next week.